Welcome to Dialogue.
We are continuing our ongoing series exploring real-world, documented examples of dirty politics. We're looking at that space where governments face immense pressure but don't have the public's permission to act.
And tonight we are absolutely not in the realm of theory or speculation. We're dealing with classified memos, formal proposals. We're moving right past the whispers and into the documented planning of power.
This is case 4, and it's a file that, well, when you read it, it forces you to completely recalibrate what you think is possible inside the halls of power. It's called Operation Northwoods.
So our mission for this deep dive is to look at this specific 1962 proposal. It came directly from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff.
And this wasn't just brainstorming. Not at all. This was a plan that was explicitly engineered to fabricate a pretext.
A pretext. A huge, undeniable justification for invading Cuba and getting rid of Fidel Castro.
That phrase, fabricated pretext, that's really everything here. The shock of Northwoods isn't that some rogue agent thought of something cynical. The shock is that this was a formal, typed, multi-page document. It was reviewed, circulated, and approved by the highest levels of the uniformed military.
And then, ultimately, it was rejected. But the fact it got that far...
That's the core of it. The truly disturbing part is that planning violence against your own civilians was considered a viable, professional, strategic option inside the system.
It really does read like a bureaucratic horror story.
Yeah.
We're not even looking at the execution of dirty politics here. We're looking at the planning stage.
This is the moment the moral lines get erased on paper, stamped top secret.
Okay, so let's unpack this. To understand how a plan like this even becomes thinkable, we have to understand the world it was born into. The early 1960s. That was not a calm time.
Not even close. You have to remember the Cold War context. It was this total existential conflict. Everything, and I mean everything, was seen through a zero-sum game of Soviet expansion versus American containment.
A pressure cooker.
A global pressure cooker. It was an environment of, frankly, paranoia and this absolute conviction that the survival of the free world was at stake with every single decision.
And then, bam. In 1959, you get this massive shift. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Exactly. Fidel Castro's communist revolution succeeds. He overthrows the Batista regime, which had been backed by the U.S. for years.
And for Washington, that's not just some distant political event.
It's a direct, immediate threat. Cuba instantly stops being just another small island nation and becomes a massive geopolitical breach.
It wasn't just about the physical distance, was it? It was more psychological than that.
Oh, profoundly psychological. Castro's success was a symbol. It was another domino falling, and it meant Soviet influence was now firmly planted in the Western Hemisphere.
Which the U.S. had considered its backyard for over a century.
Under the Monroe Doctrine, yes. Suddenly, a hostile, Soviet-aligned power is sitting right on the doorstep, and the early attempts to deal with it, they were a disaster.
Which only made the pressure worse.
Absolutely. We can't talk about Northwoods without mentioning the Bay of Pigs invasion in '61. That was a CIA-backed operation, a total, humiliating public failure for the Kennedy administration.
So that failure left Kennedy's team deeply skeptical of their own military and intelligence agencies.
But at the same time, under even more intense pressure to do something about Castro, by any means necessary.
So we have this overwhelming pressure to act, but there's this huge obstacle that forces them to look for these dirty solutions. And that obstacle was the American public.
And that is the critical trigger for this kind of politics. The leadership was convinced an invasion was a strategic necessity. But the American people, they didn't support an unprovoked invasion of Cuba.
They needed a reason, a moral justification.
They needed a mandate. There was no clear provocation. There was no catalyst.
They were missing their Pearl Harbor moment.
They needed that exact kind of galvanizing moment. An incident that turns abstract foreign policy into a gut-level demand for retaliation. In early 1962, they didn't have a Tonkin-style incident. The public was passive.
And the Joint Chiefs needed them demanding war.
That's the moment. When the objective is seen as vital but public permission is missing, the system starts looking for a shortcut.
And Operation Northwoods is the blueprint for that shortcut. It's literally a plan to fake the reason for going to war.
To casus belli, a manufactured one.
This sets the stage for the document itself. Let's move into the proposal, because the fact that this was typed up and filed with official seals, that's what makes it so chilling. Where did this actually come from?
It came from the very top, squarely within the U.S. military's highest body, the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
So we're talking about the most senior uniformed leaders of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines.
The very people tasked with advising the president on military matters.
And who is the specific person overseeing this?
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, General Lyman Lemnitzer. This was drafted under his watch in 1962 as part of a much larger covert program to destabilize Cuba called Operation Mongoose.
Northwoods was basically the plan to kick things into high gear.
It was the kinetic option, yes.
And we have to just pause on the bureaucracy of it all. This wasn't some memo scribbled on a napkin.
Not in the slightest. This was a detailed, multi-page filing. It was formal, typed on classified letterhead, complete with distribution lists. It went through channels.
Meaning multiple generals and admirals saw it, read it, and signed off on it before it ever left the Pentagon.
Which means dozens, maybe hundreds of other staff had to be involved. Planners, analysts, maybe even lawyers. They all had to work on the logistics and essentially rubber stamp the concept. The entire institutional machine was geared up to plan violence against its own side.
That's why you call it institutional false flag logic.
Exactly. The bureaucracy had processed and accepted the idea that deception, even self-inflicted mass casualty events, was an acceptable strategic tool. They already decided the ends justified these means.
So who did they finally submit this incredible proposal to?
It went directly to the civilian leadership. First, to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara.
And from there?
From there, it was presented to President John F. Kennedy for his final approval. And that path, from the JCS to the SecDef to the president, that confirms its status. This wasn't a fringe idea. This was the military's formal recommendation.
So they were formally asking the civilian leadership to authorize the murder of American citizens for a strategic goal.
Bluntly, yes, and they clearly believed it was a reasonable request to make of their commander-in-chief. In their view, they were just solving a logistical problem for him. He needed public support. They were providing the fastest way to get it.
Which brings us to the playbook itself, the specific. Because the abstract idea is one thing, but the details are what really show the mindset here. What was actually proposed?
The core idea was to create incidents, or just the overwhelming appearance of incidents, that could be blamed on Castro's government immediately and without question. It was a whole campaign of staged terror.
Let's start with the false flag attacks on U.S. soil. The plan got very specific.
Oh, very. They proposed things like simulated or even real bombings in U.S. cities. They talked about staging attacks on Cuban émigrés to make it look like Castro was hunting down his own people.
And it would all be blamed on Cuban agents.
Cuban agents operating out of Mexico or Florida, the attribution was a key part of the plan.
But the language used, it went beyond just property damage. They were planning for human casualties.
Yes, and they were brutally explicit about it. The plan openly discusses the need to create casualties and wounded, and most chillingly, it talks about the strategic value of releasing lists of names.
Lists of names. Why that specific detail? What's the function of that?
Because a statistic is cold, a number is forgettable. But a list of names is personal. It's devastating.
It's propaganda.
It's the most effective kind. The planners knew that to get that instant, overwhelming outrage, they needed funerals on TV. They needed grieving families. That personalized tragedy was the emotional fuel required to get the public and Congress demanding war.
They were literally weaponizing grief.
And calculating it as a necessary input for their strategic plan.
I think the most infamous proposal, though, involves air travel. The fake shoot-down. The drone swap. Let's walk through the logistics of that specific plan.
This one gives you the clearest and perhaps darkest insight into their thinking. The plan was to take a scheduled civilian airliner, full of passengers, and replace it with an identical, uncrewed military drone.
So, how would that even work?
Well, the real civilian flight would take off as normal from, say, a Florida airport. It would have its full passenger manifest, that list of names again. At some point along its route, it would secretly land at a secure military base. The plane and all its passengers would essentially be disappeared, kept in total isolation so the world would never know they survived.
That's an incredible level of operational security.
It's huge. And while that's happening, an uncrewed drone, a military plane painted to look exactly like the civilian airliner, flying the same route using the same transponder kind, would take its place in the sky.
So to anyone watched on radar, it looks like the same plane.
Indistinguishable. This drone would then fly toward Cuba. And once it was in position, they'd trigger the final stage.
The shoot-down.
The drone would be destroyed. They'd either trick Cuban air defenses into firing on it, or they would just blow it up themselves and make it look like an attack. Then they'd make the announcement.
That a civilian airliner with American citizens aboard had been shot down without provocation by Castro's MiGs.
And they would release the list of names from the original flight manifest. The public reaction would be instantaneous, visceral. War would become a moral imperative.
The whole thing is just a highly produced piece of theater, but with real-world consequences.
And the plan had backups. Staging fake hijackings, planting evidence, anything to build the narrative that Castro was a dangerous, reckless terrorist.
And it wasn't just civilians they were willing to target. They also proposed attacking U.S. military assets.
That's right. The plan was comprehensive. They talked about staging sabotage operations at Guantanamo Bay. They even proposed blowing up a U.S. Navy ship in the harbor.
A direct echo of the USS Maine, which started the Spanish-American War.
The parallel is impossible to miss. They were trying to manufacture their own historical trigger. And again, the goal wasn't military advantage.
No, the goal was political.
It was about creating martyrs, creating those emotional, patriotic headlines that would crush any political opposition to an invasion. It was all about manufacturing public consent.
And if you couldn't get that consent, honestly, you forge it.
That was the calculation. The ends removing Castro justified any means necessary to get there.
This brings us to the really uncomfortable question. Why wasn't this plan just laughed out of the room? Why wasn't it immediately dismissed as insane or immoral by the Joint Chiefs?
This is the hardest part to wrap your head around. If you read the declassified proposal, the tone is, well, it's completely detached. It's calm, professional, bureaucratic.
No moral debate, no ethical hand-wringing.
None. It reads like a list of bullet points, a set of options. The violence is just abstracted away. They aren't talking about killing innocent people. They're talking about generating casualties to achieve objectives.
The language itself acts as a shield.
It's a form of moral blindness. When a plan is formatted correctly, when it uses the right professional jargon, the horror it contains is just treated as another data point. The process normalizes the absolutely abnormal.
So what was the strategic rationale they were using? How did they justify it to themselves?
It was purely ends-based thinking. From their perspective, they were trying to prevent a much greater catastrophe.
Which was?
Soviet expansion in the Western Hemisphere. They genuinely saw Castro's Cuba as an existential threat to American security.
So it was the classic, we have to do this terrible thing now to prevent a worse thing later argument.
That's the logic trap. They believed a quick, decisive invasion backed by a unified country would ultimately save more lives than letting the situation fester and possibly escalate into something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was just around the corner.
So once that end goal is seen as sacred, the means you use to get there are no longer judged by morality.
They're judged by usefulness. And that is the central lesson of Northwoods. Once efficiency becomes your main metric, the moral lines don't vanish in a puff of smoke. They just quietly move to accommodate whatever the mission requires.
And this was all coming from career military officers, men who valued duty and honor.
But their training primes them to find the optimal solution to a strategic problem. In the Cold War, the problem was containment. The American public's opinion wasn't a moral check. It was a variable in the equation, an obstacle to be managed.
It's just so chilling. The very people sworn to protect the nation were drafting plans for its calculated betrayal.
It speaks to a profound capacity for compartmentalization. The clinical language wasn't a sign of chaos. It was a sign of institutional normalization. The process itself abstracts the human cost and turns it into a PR plan.
Which leads us to the crucial moment. Why did this plan fail? It was fully developed. It was approved by the military's top brass. What stopped it?
One person, President John F. Kennedy. He saw the proposal and he rejected it, flatly. Accounts suggest he was appalled and didn't even entertain the idea of revising it. He just shut it down completely.
And that rejection had consequences.
Immediate consequences. Shortly after, General Lemnitzer, the chairman who pushed the plan, was not reappointed. He was essentially removed from his post as the top military officer in the country.
Which suggests this wasn't just a simple policy disagreement?
No, it was a fundamental break. A line had been crossed, and Kennedy drew it.
But the truly fragile part of this is that the system didn't correct itself.
No, the Joint Chiefs didn't retract the proposal out of shame. The institution was ready to go.
It failed because one man said no.
Exactly. The civilian veto was the single point of failure for this entire operation. and that highlights an incredible danger. It all came down to the individual morality of the person sitting in the Oval
A
Office.
different president, under different pressures.
And the story could be catastrophically different. It shows that the ethical guardrails we assume exist are sometimes just one person's conscience.
So let's talk about the legacy. Why does this rejected plan, hidden away for decades, still matter so much today?
Because Northwoods is the proof. It proves that this kind of false flag logic wasn't some fringe conspiracy theory. It was institutional. It was a formal, high-level strategic option.
It's the skeleton key. An idea, even when rejected, doesn't just disappear.
Right. It leaves a scar on the institution's memory. A shelved plan like this does a few things. It normalizes the framework for the future. It lowers the psychological barrier.
Because it's no longer unthinkable.
It's no longer unthinkable. Future planners know that back in 1962, the Joint Chiefs formally signed off on murdering American citizens for strategic gain. That becomes a precedent. The logic chain has been established.
And that logic, that you create the narrative first and worry about verification later, we see echoes of that in other historical events, don't we?
We do, but we have to be careful not to draw a direct causal line. That's speculation. But we can absolutely connect the logic. The logic of, we need an incident. You see it in the Gulf of Tonkin, which was based on questionable evidence and massively escalated the Vietnam War. You see it in the Naira testimony before the first Gulf War, which turned out to be completely fabricated propaganda.
And of course, the WMDs in Iraq.
Exactly. The connection isn't a secret cabal, it's the methodology, the shared logic that says, the decision to act has been made, now we find or create the justification. Northwoods is the raw, declassified blueprint for that exact thinking.
And that's why this isn't a conspiracy story.
Not in the typical sense, no. The documents are real, they are public record. Dirty politics doesn't always operate in the shadows. Sometimes it files paperwork, stamps it top secret, and submits it for a formal review.
And the danger isn't just the cloak and dagger stuff. The danger is in the professional, bureaucratic justification of violence against your own people.
That's the ultimate lesson. The most dangerous ideas don't arrive screaming. They arrive formatted in a memo with calm analysis, circulated among professionals who have learned to equate what is useful with what is acceptable.
Approved ideas don't have to be moral. They just have to be useful. That's the chilling takeaway from Operation Northwoods.
It is. It shows us that the institutional capacity and the documented willingness to do this exists. It's not a theory. It's a fact of history.
A very sobering thought. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.